What if the very place meant to protect the innocent was the source of their deepest torment? Behind the thick stone walls of a medieval convent, where prayers once echoed and faith was said to flourish, lay something much darker. In these sacred halls, a noble-born nun transformed devotion into a doctrine of pain. Under the flicker of candlelight and the hum of hymns, the silence was broken only by the muffled sobs of young girls. They came to learn, to be shaped by holiness, yet instead, they were broken. This isn't legend. No tale told to frighten children. It's a real history, one buried beneath floorboards, whispered through time, and written in blood. And if you choose to walk with us through this story, be warned, what lies ahead may follow you into sleep, and never let you wake in peace again. She was born into silken scripture. Elizabeth of Palatinate, daughter of power, heir to privilege, was raised within candlelit halls where velvet touched every corner and golden crucifixes hung like silent witnesses. To the world, she was a child of blessing, a future bride of Christ, marked by destiny. But behind those watchful eyes, something had already twisted. Her playthings were not dolls or trinkets. Instead, she made little wooden effigies, bound them in scraps of cloth, and quietly pierced them with pins. Servants dismissed it as imagination. But when her nursemaid was found lifeless, eyes wide with frozen terror, whispers began to spread like rot in the rafters. No one dared say the words aloud. Not in a house ruled by power and piety. The family called it grief. The priest called it a test of faith. But some saw the way Elizabeth stared too long into the fire, or how she murmured prayers backward beneath her breath. Whatever festered inside her, it found no cure in privilege. And as she grew, so too did something darker, something not of God, but cloaked in his name. At just 15, Elizabeth entered the convent of St. Este, a sanctuary nestled deep in the countryside, where incense masked mildew and silence was law. By 17, she had already risen to its spiritual head, cloaked in respect, feared for her unflinching discipline. Noble families sent their daughters to study under her care, believing they would receive refinement and religious instruction. But Elizabeth believed something else entirely, that true devotion came only through suffering, and that salvation must be carved into flesh and memory. The first girl to learn this was named Lotte. She spoke once during evening prayer, only once, and Elizabeth led her into a stone chamber behind the altar. No one knew what occurred inside. All they heard was a scream, sharp and short, cut off too soon. When Lotte returned, she wouldn't look anyone in the eye. She shuffled instead of walked. Her hands trembled. Something had been taken from her, something no one could name. It was the beginning. Elizabeth's mask of holy fervor now hid methods no scripture could condone. But the church saw only obedience. The parents saw only results. No one questioned the quiet girl with uneven steps or the chill that seemed to linger around a nun who never blinked long enough to show weakness. Beneath Elizabeth's bed lay a small iron box, its surface rusted from years of breathless secrets. Inside were her sacred instruments, coiled cords, iron spikes, and a leather-bound Bible marked in red ink. She didn't hide them. When asked, she called them tools of purification, gifts from God to burn sin from the soul. Her rituals turned stranger with time. She would starve the girls for days, then demand they recite entire scriptures without flaw. If a single word faltered, her pale hands closed around their throats with a grip far too strong for her slender frame. Students fainted from hunger and fear, collapsing in the cold stone halls, their whispers drowned beneath chants. At night, the convent echoed with weeping too hollow to be heard as human. Yet the townsfolk offered no protest. What was suffering, they said, if it brought discipline in God's house? A few even praised Elizabeth for restoring order, blind to the bruises beneath the girls' habits, deaf to the tremble in their prayers. They never smelled the metallic tang in the air of the prayer room, iron, old and thick, clinging to the walls like a curse. But Elizabeth breathed it in like incense. To her, that scent was sacred. Winter came hard that year, burying the convent beneath a shroud of ice and silence. It was during one such frigid night that Maria, a girl of 16 with fire still left in her eyes, tried to flee. She slipped through the gate barefoot, her nightgown catching on thorns, blood trailing behind her in the snow. But she didn't get far. They found her at the edge of the woods, shaking, bleeding, eyes wild with frozen fear. Elizabeth didn't scream. She didn't punish. She declared that Maria would be baptized anew, reborn in suffering to cleanse the rebellion from her soul. What followed was no rite, it was punishment dressed as penance. Maria was dragged to the well and submerged in water so cold it burned. Her lips turned blue. Her limbs thrashed, then went still. For days, she hovered between life and death, barely breathing beneath fevered skin. When she awoke, she no longer spoke her own name. Instead, she whispered of visions, a woman of fire and ice, wings made of bone, eyes like knives. She called Elizabeth the burning angel. And from that moment on, she never stepped into the sunlight again without trembling. When spring thawed the frozen stones of St. Este, a traveling friar named Father Matthias arrived at the convent, his presence cloaked in quiet suspicion. He noticed it immediately, the stiff smiles, the hollow greetings, the way the older nuns stood too still and the younger ones looked only at the floor. When he asked questions, their answers came rehearsed, each one identical, as if memorized from a script written in fear. Only one dared to break the pattern, a mute orphan girl named Elsa. With trembling hands, she slipped a drawing into his palm. It showed a woman's face, twisted in rage, looming above a pit of fire. That night, Matthias waited. At dusk, he watched as Elizabeth disappeared into the catacombs below the chapel. She didn't return for hours. The following night, he followed. Quiet. Careful. What he found beneath the convent was not a place of prayer. It was a labyrinth carved in stone, dimly lit by wax-stripped candles. Chains hung from the walls, dark stains pooled on the floor. In one corner stood a wooden kneeler studded with nails, its surface wet and red. A Bible sat atop it, its pages unreadable, soaked through. But beside it lay something worse, a ledger. Page after page bore names. Children. Some crossed out. Others marked with strange symbols. None accounted for. All vanished. And in that moment, Matthias realized he was standing in a chapel of silence, built not for salvation, but for erasure. Matthias fled before dawn, the ledger clutched to his chest, but sleep refused to find him. For weeks, he pored over the names, traveling to nearby villages in search of answers. No one knew where the girls had gone. Some parents had received letters, claims of illness, of sudden death, but none had seen the bodies. None had dared to ask for proof. Meanwhile, back at St. Este, Elizabeth escalated her rituals. She declared a holy season of reckoning, claiming that God demanded purification. The students were stripped of their comforts, isolated, made to kneel for hours on bare stone. They were forbidden to speak, even to dream. And when one disobeyed, the others were forced to watch. Helena, the Baron's daughter, was next. She had whispered a Latin prayer incorrectly. That night, she was dragged into the cellars. What the girls heard were two sounds, rhythmic chanting and the scrape of metal on stone. Days later, Helena returned. Her hands were wrapped in bandages. She never wrote again. The convent had grown quiet, not from peace, but from fear so thick it smothered breath. One nun, Sister Agnes, tried to resist. She confessed her doubts in the chapel's confessional. The next morning, she was found face down in the garden well, her eyes wide, staring at the sky. Elizabeth called it a tragic accident. No one questioned her. When Matthias returned with a forged letter granting inspection, Elizabeth welcomed him with thin contempt. That night, the chapel doors were bolted, but a servant, bribed with silver, led Matthias back into the crypt. The room had been cleaned, but the scent lingered, burnt fabric, singed hair. On the wall, freshly carved words, Dominic Liberanos, Lord, deliver us." He took the ledger and fled. Hours later, Elizabeth discovered it was missing. Her rage was ice. She gathered the students at midnight for a ritual of erasure, demanding they purge the memory of the heretic. Elsa, the mute, was made to kneel on shattered glass. In the capital, Matthias pleaded for an inquiry. The church hesitated. Elizabeth's noble blood shielded her, but one bishop relented. Soldiers were dispatched. The news reached the convent by dusk. That very night, Elizabeth conducted what she called the final benediction. At sunrise, smoke rose from the chapel's rear. The soldiers stormed in. The halls were empty. The dormitories abandoned. But behind the altar, the scent of iron led them down. In the catacombs, they found the missing. Over a dozen girls, chained, starved, trembling. Some muttered psalms through cracked lips. Others only stared. And in a hidden chamber sat a throne-like chair soaked in blood, surrounded by drawings of angels with blades for wings. Elizabeth was nowhere to be found. Elizabeth had vanished. No carriage tracks, no footprints, no witnesses. It was as if she had simply dissolved into the stone itself. The only thing left behind was her personal Bible, open on the chapel altar, soaked in wax and blood. One verse was underlined in thick, trembling ink: "I will show you the way, even through fire." The survivors were taken to the bishop's care. Many could no longer speak. Those who could told tales that curdled the soul, punishments disguised as penance, nails driven beneath fingernails for impure thoughts, heads forced under freezing water during midnight confessions. The girls' bodies bore the truth in scars, and Elsa's hidden drawings filled in what words could not. One, in particular, silenced the entire chamber. It showed Elizabeth, arms raised above a pit, blood cascading from her palms like holy water, while faceless children below reached up in agony. The church could no longer deny. Elizabeth was declared a heretic and a fugitive. Her family raged, claiming slander and conspiracy, but fear had already taken root among the nobility. If even a nun could become a monster, who else might be hiding behind the veil? Rumors bloomed like rot. Some claimed Elizabeth had escaped to France, disguised as a widow. Others swore she had joined a cult in the Black Forest. One tale even said her own disciples turned on her and burned her alive. None were confirmed, until, months later, a hunter stumbled upon a chapel buried deep in the woods near Mainz. Vines clawed at its stone. Inside, he found burned tapestries, extinguished candles, and a single body cloaked in black, its face long eaten away. In the corpse's hand was a rosary etched with the Palatinate crest. On the wall, smeared in dried blood, were 3 Latin words: sanguis, lux, redemptio, blood, light, redemption. The church buried the body in secret, no rites, no name. Only stone. But the whispers did not stop. Whispers took root where fire could not. Farmers near Mainz spoke of hymns echoing from the ruined chapel, of a woman in grey watching from the woods, her veil fluttering though the air was still. Time passed, but the pain Elizabeth left behind lingered like mold in the soul. Helena never recovered. She wandered her family estate reciting scripture backward, drawing angels with broken wings on every wall. Elsa grew into a woman of silence, but one night she too vanished, leaving behind a single torn page from Elizabeth's ledger, freshly written. Father Matthias, now promoted within the church, never returned to the convent. He died years later, crucifix clenched so tightly it left scars in his palm. His final words were barely a whisper: "We thought she was a servant of God, but she made herself something else." Centuries later, during renovations of the ruined convent, workers uncovered a chamber buried beneath the catacombs. Inside stood a small statue of the Virgin Mary, its eyes gouged out. Beneath it, carved in deliberate Latin, the words, "Deliver us not from evil. Let us be reborn through it." Scholars were horrified. The phrase matched no known scripture. Some believed it was a fragment from a lost doctrine, perhaps written by Elizabeth herself. Others claimed it was proof of a cult, the Grey Sisterhood, a secretive sect said to have emerged after her disappearance. These women believed that suffering unlocked spiritual purity. Their creed, pain purifies. Silence sanctifies. Over the following decades, convents across Europe began reporting strange occurrences, nuns vanishing, children found with strange sigils etched into their skin. In one case, a chapel collapsed during Mass, revealing a hidden basement lined with rusted shackles. Beneath the altar, scratched into the stone, was one word, Elizabeth. There was never enough proof. Never a clear link. But to those who had seen the ledger, who remembered the names crossed out in blood-red ink, there was no doubt. Her gospel had not ended. It had only spread. Elizabeth was never caught, never tried, never punished, not by men. Yet history has a cruel patience, and her legacy festers in its shadows. For some, she remains a myth, a cautionary tale whispered to young girls behind convent walls, obey, or the sadistic nun will come for you. But to the families who lost their daughters, she was no myth. She was a wound that history never closed. In 1813, a German physician named Dr. William Koig claimed to have discovered Elizabeth's lost diary. Inside were vivid accounts of fasting, flagellation, and visions of burning angels. He presented it to a university. Days later, he was found dead in his study, his eyes gouged out. The diary vanished. Only one page remained, inked in iron gall, "Through pain, we become immaculate." The handwriting matched Elizabeth's ledger. St. Egidia's ruins still stand, barely. Locals refuse to go near them. Tourists come, but none linger past sunset. Some claim to hear chanting from beneath the ground. Others say they've seen a figure standing in the bell tower, her habit fluttering though there is no wind. A girl named Anukika once spent the night there on a dare. Her friends found her the next morning outside the crypt, barefoot, muttering the Lord's Prayer backward, the name Elizabeth carved into her arm with a rusted nail. Theologians debate Elizabeth's nature. Was she mad, possessed, or simply drunk on power masked by piety? Perhaps all three. Or perhaps she tapped into something older, something darker than faith. One thing is certain, those who peer too deeply into her story never leave untouched. Some believe she still watches, still waits, wandering her ruined chapel for someone brave, or foolish, enough to kneel. Elsa's final ledger page, examined under ultraviolet light, revealed strange symbols, a weeping child, an inverted cross wrapped in thorns. Some say Elizabeth's disappearance wasn't an escape but a ritual, a transformation. That she didn't flee judgment, she became something beyond it. A confession uncovered from a 17th century nun read, "We did not follow Elizabeth. She followed something else. Something that whispered in the dark and wore the face of God." The confession was burned immediately after. Even now, cursed relics resurface, a cracked rosary that causes hallucinations, a Latin prayer page that bleeds when touched by candlelight. Most are hoaxes. Some are not. One historian drowned himself in holy water after acquiring a copy of Elizabeth's personal Bible. A paranormal team streamed a 6-hour exploration of the ruins in 2019. The final 30 minutes were corrupted. When restored, only one frame remained, a blurred figure in a nun's habit standing behind the cameraman. The church maintains silence. The Vatican archives list the case as a doctrinal anomaly. In the margins of the bishop's final report, someone had scrawled, "There are others." No name. No explanation. The convent site is now protected by the state. No further excavation allowed. But a drone operator once filmed a figure kneeling at the altar at midnight. The footage disappeared within hours. Some believe the children's spirits still wander the nearby woods, voiceless and waiting. Others claim their prayers, unfinished and unanswered, cling to the stone walls beneath. When the wind is still and the fog creeps low, a voice is said to echo from the crypt, "Let the innocent suffer. Let their pain cleanse the world." The church never canonized the victims. Their names were erased. Their families silenced. But truth seeps through even the thickest stone. Every so often, a new document appears, scratched names, a hidden testimony, a scream echoing from the past. A reminder, Elizabeth was real. And her darkness wasn't buried. Only hidden. Modern psychologists call her one of the earliest documented cases of spiritual sadism. But others argue what she practiced was not insanity, it was method. Ritual. Intent. She wasn't punishing. She was testing. Experimenting. Measuring what it takes to break a soul and rebuild it in her own image. Her greatest horror wasn't the torture, but the belief that suffering was holy. That salvation could be found through agony. And this belief, this poison, still echoes. The ruins of St. Este attract the curious and the damned alike. Graffiti marks the crypt now, her blood runs still. Make me clean. A priest tasked with blessing the site in 2007 left mid-prayer, trembling, whispering, something answered. He was defrocked soon after. To this day, locals light candles for the missing girls. But they never speak their names. Names have power, they say. So does memory. Elizabeth was never sentenced by any earthly court. But her legacy is a life sentence for those left behind. Because history is full of monsters. But the ones draped in holiness, whispering scripture while holding a blade, those are the hardest to see. And the hardest to stop. If you ever visit the ruins, do not speak her name. Do not kneel. And above all, do not listen if someone whispers behind you, confess. Elizabeth is gone. But her gospel of pain still echoes. And if we forget, if we fall silent, then the veil will never lift. And history will kneel again.